Last year, the FCC wisely adopted broadband privacy rules that put consumers in control of their sensitive information. But now the broadband industry and their allies are fighting to strip away the fundamental privacy protections under the guise of harmonization of regulations. We could vote this week on a Congressional Review Act resolution rescinding these rules. When, when the industry says harmonization, they really mean self-regulation. Commissioner McSweeny, in a recent op-ed, you stated that efforts to rescind the broadband privacy rules through the CRA process will not actually harmonize regulations, but create a, quote, yawning chasm where broadband and cable companies have no discernible regulation. Could you explain?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. The point that I'm trying to make is that both the FTC and the FCC have an important role to play in making sure that people have choices and control over their sensitive personal information. And in the always-on, always-connected environment that we now live, those choices are even more important than ever. Something like 91% of American consumers feel they've lost control of their data. So rather than rolling back rules that simply guarantee that they get a choice, we should be doing everything in our best efforts, both at the FTC and at the FCC and in other parts of the government, to protect those choices and guarantee them. So
should we be allowing broadband companies to collect, to use, to sell sensitive information about subscribers' health, finances, and children without first getting consent from those families?
Well, the FTC's perspective over 20 years of protecting consumer privacy.
No, I'm talking about those Federal Communications Commission.
Right. And
those rules should stay on the books.
I strongly support those rules because they are consistent with what the FTC has required, which is choices be offered to people before their sensitive information is used.
Thank you. A last-minute provision in the 2015 budget deal makes it easier for government debt collectors to harness tens of millions of consumers on their mobile phones. And last summer, the Federal Communications Commission, in response to a Supreme Court ruling, exempted the entire federal government and its contractors for key robocall protections. This carve-out for government robocallers coincides with the rise in tax and debt collection scams, where criminals posing as IRS agents and debt collectors call innocent Americans, telling them they must promptly wire them money or be subject to arrest, deportation, or revocation of driver licenses. Americans have lost millions of dollars because of these scams. A provision in the 2015 Surface Transportation Bill actually encourages the IRS to hire private debt collectors to collect certain unpaid taxes, private tax collectors that can now robocall and robotext consumers without their consent. I'm concerned that consumers could find it even more difficult to detect fraudulent calls because of these recent actions. Commissioner McSweeny, Commissioner Ohlhausen, do you agree with me that there should be much concern about this change in law?
Senator, when the FCC proposed a notice of proposed rulemaking about government debt collection, the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection did file a comment raising some concerns. And when the FCC adopted the final rule, they did adopt several of the recommendations that the FTC staff had included, things such as limiting the duration of the call, excluding any calls from that coverage that would have any marketing, requiring callers to affirmatively inform debtors of their right to make the request to stop calls. So I did share those concerns, and I was pleased to see that the FCC took those into account in the final rule. As for the IRS plan to use private debt collector contractors, I think it will raise an additional informational challenge and educational challenge for the FTC as they tell consumers how to be wary of imposter scams.
I would just add, I agree. I think consumer confusion here is a very strong possibility, and that could be problematic. And that our second most prevalent complaint is bad debt collection practices. And to the extent that we have debt collection occurring, we need to make sure that rules are followed that protect consumers' interests in those proceedings.
Thank you. And earlier this month, Senator Lee from Utah and I introduced the Bipartisan Hang Up Act, the Help Americans Never Get Unwanted Phone Calls Act. The bill closes these loopholes and ensures that consumers do not receive unwanted robocalls and robotexts from federal government contractors without consent. Last year, the FTC received over 5 million complaints about unwanted calls. In light of this high volume of consumer complaints, would you support our legislation, Senator Lee, the Hang Up Act? Commissioner.
Senator, I haven't seen the act. I'd certainly be happy to take a look at it, and I share the goals of that act. I am concerned about consumer complaints, and it's something we have paid close attention to at the FTC over the years.
Commissioner McSweeny?
I agree.
Okay, thank you. I am the original House author of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, and I'm going to oppose anything that undermines these fundamental protections which people want in their homes, from unwanted invasions of their privacy, compromise of information that is sensitive to their family. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman.